On most days, I would encourage you just to take your watercolor sketchbook along with you wherever you happen to be going and just do some quick sketching. Just observe things that are ordinary and mundane. But there's always going to be times where you go into a situation actually with the intention of doing some nice paintings. And so that was kind of my intention here. It right now, of course, is fall, my favorite time of year. I love everything about fall. And so I kind of wanted to go and just capture a feeling of fall in one of my favorite places here at the Earl May Garden Center, where they have just not only amazing fall produce, of course, pumpkins, but I love the arrangements. I love the abundance. And so I really wanted to go and capture some of the unique things that I might see here. Of course, I'm going to get myself a couple of pumpkins, but I'm not going to be able to buy all of these. But maybe I want to spend some time capturing all of these colors. And so I brought my little sketchbook with me. I brought my tiny little watercolor palette with me and my water brush. And I'm just looking around to see what I might be able to paint. So of course, there's all these heirloom pumpkins. They come in these really nice pastel colors, and taken all together, they're very beautiful. Maybe one heirloom pumpkin by itself can be interesting to look at as well, but what really caught my eye was the way that all together, all these contrasting colors really made a nice composition. And I also really liked just the big piles of orange pumpkins. So it was a little bit cold, so I had to wear my gloves, and I decided that I wanted to try to simplify some of these big piles of pumpkins at the garden center. And this is going to be just a really quick sketch on location. Of course, sitting at the park by yourself or with a friend can be really nice and relaxing. It's a good way to paint. And as I said, anytime that you're painting on location, you're just automatically going to be working a little bit faster. But if you're in a situation where maybe you're feeling a little bit awkward about doing a painting, pick something that you have the objective of simplifying and just kind of painting or sketching as fast as you can without really any regard for detail or composition or anything like that. So that's what I'm going to be doing here. There's people walking around. Of course, I look a little bit extra awkward because I have my tripod with my camera set up. And so I don't want to draw too much attention. That's not really my style. I'm a little bit shy, actually. So I just want to do a really quick and easy sketch here. And I want to explore these big piles of pumpkins. And the idea that I had was I really liked the way that there was just a sign kind of sticking out of this big mass of pumpkins. So I'm going to go ahead and sketch that in first. And I decided too that I would take this opportunity to focus a little bit less on color and the watercolor techniques and find a way to integrate ink into this process, because I haven't really done that so far, even though I always bring my ink pen along with me. So I'm using my pencil here just to kind of lightly sketch everything in, and I'm not going in and sketching each individual pumpkin. As you can see, I kind of just created a big mass, a big outline, and I'm going to just basically fill that up with orange paint. But first, I am going to do a little bit of ink work on the sign. I really like, again, the contrast of the sign with all the pumpkins. And so I am just going to create this little sign. I'm going to color it black so that it has some nice contrast. And then I'm going to get into painting. And I mentioned earlier, but if you're going to do any kind of mixed media where you're using ink along with your watercolor, if you want to do any inking before you apply your watercolor, you need to make sure that you're using a permanent waterproof ink. These micron pens are really nice because they are very waterproof. And it's not that you have to use a waterproof ink pen when you're doing watercolor, but you do need to know whether or not your ink is waterproof or not, because if it's not, then you would probably want to do the inking after you do your watercolor. If you're using waterproof ink, then you can do whatever inking you want and then apply the watercolor on top. But if not, just make sure that you do your watercolor first and then you apply your ink. So my goal here, again, is just to kind of simplify this big mass of pumpkins, but make it look really interesting. So all I am going to do is just apply a really nice big wash over this whole area. And I want there to be lots of color variation. So I want it to shift from, being a little bit more of a yellow orange to red orange to true orange, maybe some spots of pure yellow, some spots of pure red in there just to make it really interesting. And I'm completely disregarding every single individual pumpkin in here. I'm not paying any attention whatsoever to individual pumpkins. I'm treating this whole pile like it's just one big orange mass, and really just kind of exploring the way that I can make my colors shift and come together in interesting ways, and using a wet into wet technique to do that. And sometimes the way that you approach a sketch is going to be less dictated by the actual subject matter that you're doing and maybe more about your circumstance. So, for example, it was a little bit chilly out. Wearing gloves while you're trying to paint is a little bit awkward, though not impossible by any means. And also, I was standing up because there was not really any place to sit, and I was in standing in a parking lot basically, or, on a sidewalk right next to the parking lot. There's people all over the place. So I really wanted to find something I could paint in a way that I could simplify it and not have to spend too much time kind of standing here and contemplating every little detail of the scene. So you can see how nicely all of these wet into wet techniques are working to create a lot of color variation in this composition. I decided to add a couple of small pumpkins into the background where I have a lot of white space, and I'm leaving the background completely white. I'm not going to try to paint the, big palettes that these pumpkins are sitting on, or the concrete, or any, shadows or anything like that. So I've got this big orange wash here, and I'm just going to set it down, let it dry, kind of look around, and now I'm back. Seemed fast, but I was probably gone for maybe 3 minutes while this dried up. So now that this is dry, I'm just going to use my ink pen again just to add each pumpkin in here. So again, I'm not trying to look at the big pile of pumpkins and to actually draw every single pumpkin that I see in the pile. I just want to create the impression of a bunch of pumpkins in a pile. And so I'm going to go in, I'm going to vary my shapes a little bit so that they're not all perfectly round or anything like that. Maybe some of them are tilting over or laying on their side. Some are oblong, some are more round, some are a little bit lumpy. And not even really, again, looking at the pumpkins themselves to do this. So I just want to do this really quickly. And now that I have all of those pumpkin shapes, this is the part that's going to really bring this all together, just adding some stems here. And again, I'm just making sure that there's some variation. I don't want them all to be upright. Some of the stems are going to be longer, some are going to be shorter, some are going to be, curved and twisted, some will be more straight. And all of these little variations are going to really make this composition come together and just look really nice. And again, when I look back on this sketch in a couple of months, I think it's just going to bring some warm feelings to me, and I'm going to be able to kind of appreciate it, even though, I probably spent less than 10 minutes working on this. I think that just the simple act of sketching something ordinary makes it a very special and nostalgic experience. So it doesn't always have to be complex. It doesn't always have to be, grand or majestic. It can just be something ordinary. And just by virtue of you spending some time with it and observing it and putting it onto paper, it just makes it feel a little bit special. And as important as it is to try to get on location and do a little bit of observational painting, there are just going to be times where you don't want to necessarily hang around that same spot for a really long time to do all the sketching that you want to do. And so it's perfectly acceptable, and I encourage you just to take photographs, little snapshots of the scene and things that you would like to paint. So as I had mentioned, as when I was walking around the garden center, something that really caught my eye was all those heirloom pumpkins and how altogether they just created a really nice pastel color scheme that I wanted to explore. But because it was kind of chilly and because there were so many people walking around, I didn't want to be in people's ways. So I just took a couple of photographs, some snapshots of those pumpkins. And also, those pumpkins, they were kind of sparse. There weren't a ton of them, and they were kind of separated from each other. And so I couldn't really find a great composition in that either. So what I'm going to be doing here, I'm back in my studio, my nice comfortable studio, but I still want to kind of explore some of those themes and have some pages in my sketchbook dedicated to this time of year. And, what I love, well, not most, but one thing that I love a lot about this time of year, of course, is all the pumpkins and the produce that you get, just that idea of, harvest and abundance. So again, I just took some photographs and I'm going to do a little bit of sketching. And the important thing here is to just keep in mind what inspired you to take the photos, what made you want to paint this scene, and keep that in mind as you're doing your sketch. Because again, a lot of times with sketching, we want to kind of isolate what we're looking at and make it a study on some particular aspect of what we observed or maybe what inspired us a little bit. So for me, it definitely was not about the composition. And so I kind of just sketched in all of these pumpkins, different sizes, different shapes, kind of just all over this horizontal spread in my sketchbook. I made one pumpkin that I liked the most, kind of the center, which is this one right here. This is the one that I actually ended up buying and bringing home with me. And so it's going to be kind of my focal point, but I'm not looking at my photo reference and trying to figure out where each pumpkin was sitting next to some other particular pumpkin. I just kind of sketched all of those in, and this sketch is really going to be more about the colors and the way that those all came together to create something really pleasing to my eye. So again, it's not about painting each particular pumpkin the way that it actually was. It's really more about having all of these colors next to each other. And so right now what I'm doing is I'm letting all of those colors kind of merge into each other. Even though I sketched each individual pumpkin on my page, I'm not painting them necessarily separately from one another. I want all of my edges to stay really wet. I want lots of soft edges, and I want all of those colors to just kind of merge together. And I want to explore how those can kind of work together to create this nice color palette. So there might be colors next to each other like reds and greens that you wouldn't think would look really great merging into one another, but that's really what I wanted to experiment with in this sketch, is just allowing those things to happen and, just kind of seeing how it turned out. So I started out with a really light wash of wet into wet paint with all these pastel colors, lots of oranges, reds, greens, yellows, and just let those kind of come together as they would. And now I'm going in and defining each individual pumpkin just a little bit more, spending more time on my focal point here on that center pumpkin. And now I'm just building in a little bit of form, but not too much. I still want this to feel very sketchy. I'm not trying to paint every single detail or every little nuance of these pumpkins because this is really a study about color and not a study of form. But I just want to give each one a little bit of, an individual touch and just kind of see how this can kind of come together. And again, it's all about keeping your mind open to experimentation, being okay with things that don't go the way that you would necessarily want them to, and accepting the painting process for what it is, allowing it to somewhat lead you just by the virtue of the medium that we're working with, watercolor. We have to at times know when to just let it do what it's going to do and not try to control it too much. It really should be something that you can relax into. And again, when you are painting something that really matters to you and you really want it to count, doing all of these very relaxed, casual studies where you just experimented with allowing the medium to kind of, do whatever it's going to do and let go of it, those are all going to help you to approach those bigger paintings, those more finished paintings, with a more relaxed mindset, because you're going to understand the medium. The process is going to be a little bit more ingrained into you and come more naturally to you. And that is really the value of doing all of these studies, just experimenting and really getting to know this medium that can be a little bit slippery for a lot of people when they're just starting out. But once you embrace its properties, then you can really fully utilize it to your advantage. Another way that you might want to improve your watercolor skills is by exploring different styles of watercolor painting. So, one of my favorite styles of watercolor paintings to look at that I haven't honestly spent much time practicing is this urban sketching style. And it does seem to have kind of a particular style to it, although there's many artists who do urban sketching, and there's of course lots of variations in the style. But what I really like about this style of painting, and what I would like to explore myself just a little bit more, is the use of very loose drawing and this kind of inky, sketchy, almost coloring book style of painting. It's just, to me, it feels fun, it feels fresh, and it's something that I think that I might want to spend a little bit more time doing. So having a sketchbook and having kind of a daily painting practice frees you up to explore not just your own natural way of painting, which for me is a little bit more on the realistic or impressionistic style, but to explore other things too. And that can actually help to inform your painting altogether. So even if I don't end up, becoming an urban sketcher per se, it is something that I can maybe incorporate into my normal painting style, my normal process a little bit, and maybe just add something a little bit more unique. So what I'm doing here is I'm working from another photograph that I took while I was at the Earl May Garden Center, and I just wanted to kind of capture the whole scene. So I'm doing a horizontal kind of panorama spread here in my sketchbook, and I'm really focusing on approaching especially the drawing very, very loosely. So now I always do approach my drawings very loosely in watercolor, but I kind of lean toward the more realistic. So I try to get my proportions very accurate, my angles pretty accurate, and I go for a more naturalistic style. But for this sketching style, this urban sketching style, I really want to exaggerate maybe like the wonkiness of my lines. So I don't want to have lines perfectly straight. For example, the lines that create the contour of the building, those can be just a little bit crooked, a little bit more loose, a little more casual. And I really like that style. So I'm kind of making the attempt to focus more on the style than anything else in this sketch. So as I said earlier, I think that when you're approaching a sketch, it's really beneficial to kind of isolate your intention for the sketch. So it's not always going to be about having an overall like beautiful masterpiece painting that you're going to bring it home and hang it on your wall right away. Sometimes you're just exploring one simple concept, one simple application or technique or color scheme, something like that. And so in this case, I'm really focused more on this urban sketch style than anything else. So the color is going to be secondary. The watercolor techniques themselves are somewhat secondary, although the techniques are just going to become sort of built into your muscle memory as you proceed. And so that's something that you'll have to think about less and less as it becomes a little bit more natural to you. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking for opportunities to kind of create these simple, sketchy, almost cartoon-like lines within the painting to represent this whole scene. And I'm going to focus on having a lot of shape variation between the more geometric shapes of the building, the windows, the light pole there, and then the more organic shapes of all of the plants out in front. So that is really what I'm focusing more on here instead of, color or technique. And so you can see here that it's almost taking on a coloring book kind of feel, although I don't want to go in with too many details with my pen because I want to have a lot of nice bright colors kind of become the detail of this painting, or it will feel more detailed than it is. So here we've got a bunch of piles of pumpkins again, and you can see I started out with just kind of a big mass, and now I'm going in and just lightly indicating some of the individual pumpkins. It doesn't have to make perfect sense. They don't all have to, have finished lines or anything like that. So I just want to give an impression of these pumpkins sitting out front. And that is pretty much all that I need to do for the drawing. Maybe I'll put in some of these panes here where the glass doors are in the distance. It is a little bit tricky to know how much detail to put in, like how much is enough or how much might end up being too much. I did decide to put in some of the lettering on the building because I think that that gives a little bit of context to the whole painting and also plays into that contrast between the geometric shapes, the man-made shapes, and then the organic shapes of all the plants. So another thing that I'm going to do is leave some white space. So instead of painting the sky blue like it actually was in life, I'm just going to leave it white. I'm actually not going to have probably any blue in this painting. So sometimes having some white space is a good way to practice restraint with watercolor. And I know that I tend to not leave really any white space, but it's something that when I look at other people's watercolor paintings, that's something that I always really like because it gives it a impression of being very minimalistic and casual, and so that's what I'm going to intentionally do in this little painting. And again, even when I'm doing my color, I want to have some nice shifts of color, so I don't want everything just to be one solid color. And I'm not really paying attention to the actual colors in the photograph. That's kind of a starting point for me as I proceed through the actual painting process, but I'm not trying to replicate the colors that I'm observing or the, form shadows or anything like that. Everything is going to stay very simple and loose and kind of flat. And another thing that I really like about this style of painting, this urban sketching style of painting, is that while everything on an individual level is very simple and almost childlike and very playful, when it all comes together, it creates a composition that I think just kind of creates the illusion of complexity. And I really like that because when you, again, look at any individual element on an urban sketch, it looks very simplistic and almost like a coloring book page from, a kid's coloring book. But all taken together, I think that it creates some really nice intricacies, and that's really what I want to explore here as well. If I can take this kind of panoramic scene that's been very, very simplified, and I can use color variation to create a really complete looking composition, that's kind of my aim here. And I'm using my colors very subjectively. As I said, the photograph is just kind of a starting point, so the building itself isn't really this nice warm orange color. It's more of like a concrete gray. So I decided just to kind of exaggerate the warmth of those colors and all the shadow areas. I'm just kind of using a very nice muted violet uniformly for all those areas, not thinking too much about, the actual colors that I'm observing in the photograph or that I can remember from when I was actually standing there, and just kind of having fun with the colors, being very playful and loose with them. And even as I go in and paint a lot of the plants and the organic objects, I'm not really going off of the photo all the time. Sometimes I'm going off of where I want a little bit more color variation. So one thing that I will start to notice as I proceed through this painting is that I have a ton of orange and yellow, and then secondary to that is kind of the greens and the violets. And so when I get closer to the end of the painting, there's going to be some things that I left undone, and I'm going to make some artistic license choices in those areas where I'm going to maybe splash in some bright red. So just to give it a little bit of contrast and interest, because right now the colors not super interesting, but it's kind of funny how just adding one splash of an accent color can bring a whole new life and vibrancy to the painting overall. So here I'm adding in some of that red. Of course, the sign actually was red in real life, so that does help. Just kind of creates a really nice focal point and some points of contrast between all these other colors, which again are mostly oranges and greens, a little bit of violet. So it's nice to have just a few splashes of extra color going on. And I think leaving the sky white really helps to create some uniformity of the colors, some consistency between the color scheme, because there's really nothing in the foreground that's actually blue. And so I think painting the sky blue would have just made the color scheme seem a little bit less concise. Right now, I really like that this has almost every color except blue because I feel like it just gives a really nice uniform feeling to the overall composition without it feeling too complicated or like I was actually trying to go in and paint everything as it is in real life. So again, I encourage you to use sketching and daily painting as a way to explore different ways of approaching painting, different techniques, different styles, anything that you might just be a little bit curious about and you're not quite sure if it's for you. Use sketching as an opportunity to explore those things and really expand your horizons.